Welcome to Lecture 6, Understanding Advanced Models. The previous lecture taught you to build a tax benefit model from scratch in Python. This lecture moves to the real world. We introduce the Landman Economics Tax Transfer Model, the most sophisticated external microsimulation model available to UK researchers, and use it to conduct the kind of analysis that appears in peer-reviewed journals, informs Hansard debates, and shaped public understanding of a decade of austerity. This lecture has two major contributions. First, it demonstrates how cumulative distributional analysis works in practice, using the Landman TTM's analysis of the £26 billion in social security cuts implemented between 2010 and 2020. Second, it introduces the full UK parameter set and fiscal ready reckoner that will underpin your own reform design in the next lecture. It also extends to public services spending, modelling cuts to health, education and social care alongside the cash transfer changes that are the traditional focus of tax benefit microsimulation. By the end of this lecture, you will understand what distinguishes professional-grade microsimulation from the teaching model you built in the previous lecture, and you will be equipped with the fiscal literacy, what major reforms cost and what they achieve, needed for the policy design activities ahead. If you have access to an account, please have practical demonstration 5 and 6 open alongside these slides. We cover 9 topics: how the tools were developed, what they revealed about austerity, what data they require, what their limitations are, and how they can be used prospectively. The historical context is brief but important. Understanding why the Landman TTM was created in 2009 helps you understand the institutional gap it filled. The austerity analysis is the substantive core. We are concerned here with understanding Britain's fiscal moving parts and the ready reckoner. These are directly practical concerns. The parameter set tells you what levers are available, and the ready reckoner tells you how much each lever costs or raises. These numbers, £7 billion to raise the personal allowance by £1,000, £8 billion to increase UC adult rates by £100 per month, are what analysts use when constructing reform packages. You will need them for the next lecture. The history of microsimulation in the UK is not a neutral technical narrative. It is bound up with specific political demands for distributional evidence. Understanding this explains both the timing of when the tools were developed and why the Landman TTM was created when it was. The technical prerequisites for microsimulation came together in the early 1980s. Survey data with adequate sample sizes for distributional analysis had been collected since the 1960s. But the computational power to run thousands of tax and benefit calculations on household datasets was not available until mainframe computers at universities and government departments, and then international business machines, IBM, PCs, provided it. The IFS tax benefit, TAXBEN model, launched in 1983, was the first major academic tax benefit model in the UK. The political context was equally important. The 1980s were a period of radical change to both the tax system and the benefit system. The top income tax rate fell from 83% in 1979 to 40% by 1988. VAT nearly doubled from 8% to 15% in 1979. The benefit system was significantly restructured. These changes created intense demand among researchers, campaigners and journalists for distributional analysis: who gained, who lost, and by how much. The Landman TTM was launched in 2009 to fill a specific gap. The IFS and EUR OMOD had models, but rarely accepted external research commissions. The government's own models, Income and General Operations Tax Model, IGOTM, and the DWP's Policy Simulation Model were for internal governmental use only. The IGOTM was an internal HMRC microsimulation model used to assess the distributional effects of income tax changes, available only to government analysts rather than external researchers. For the first time, the Landman TTM gave NGOs, think tanks, and academic researchers outside these institutions access to credible, commissioned distributional analysis of tax benefit reforms. The scale of welfare reform in the 2000s was extraordinary. Over £26 billion in social security spending was cut by the 2020-21 fiscal year, relative to a baseline in which benefits had simply been maintained at their 2010 levels and uprated by RPI inflation. That is approximately 1.2% of UK gross domestic product, GDP, equivalent to several times the annual NHS capital budget. GDP is the total monetary value of all goods and services produced within a country in a given period, used as the standard measure of national economic output. The individual policy changes that produce this aggregate figure are listed in our accompanying textbook, and each is analytically interesting. The personal allowance increase from £6,475 to £12,500 was consistently presented by government as a progressive measure benefiting lower earners. The TTM analysis showed this was misleading because the allowance saves more in absolute terms for higher rate taxpayers than basic rate taxpayers, and because the gains were more than offset for the bottom deciles by simultaneous benefit cuts, the net effect for many of the lowest income households was negative. The switch from RPI to CPI uprating may sound like a technical change, but compounded over a decade, it produced a substantial real terms reduction in the value of benefits and tax credits. The introduction of the benefit cap and the two-child limit created particular concentrations of loss in specific household types, large families, renters in high-cost areas that aggregate decile analysis alone cannot fully reveal. The political contribution of the TTM analysis is worth noting. Statistics from the model were cited in Hansard, the official record of parliamentary debates, and in national media. This is not common for academic microsimulation. It reflects both the political salience of the questions being asked and the credibility of the methodology. When the government claimed the personal allowance increase was progressive, the TTM analysis provided the numbers to challenge that claim directly and publicly. The embedded YouTube video explores the effects of austerity on inequality in the UK. The distributional analysis produced by the TTM is best understood through the three methodological features that Reed's 2020 paper exemplifies. The cumulative approach is the most important. The austerity programme of the 2000s was not a single policy. It was dozens of separate announcements across 10 years of budgets and spending reviews. Analysing each in isolation would miss the interaction effects. A benefit cut combined with a tax allowance increase produces a different net distributional outcome than either change alone. By taking a cumulative view, the TTM was able to produce a holistic assessment showing that the overall impact was overwhelmingly regressive. The finding that the second poorest decile lost approximately 10% of net income is stark and politically significant. The breakdown by Equality Act characteristics is what made the TTM particularly valuable for the work with the Equality and Human Rights Commission, showing that welfare reforms had discriminatory impact on women, disabled people, and households with multiple children provided a legal as well as a political argument. The two-child limit, for example, is shown to have produced losses of over £5,000 per year for families with 3 or more children, a concrete, verifiable number that directly informed parliamentary challenges to that policy. The policy type decomposition is the analytical nuance that separates careful distributional analysis from headline-grabbing but oversimplified claims. The TTM can show that income tax changes produced an inverted U profile that indirect tax changes were regressive, and that universal credit changes had complex and non-linear distributional effects. This level of detail allows policymakers and advocates to understand which specific components of a reform package drove which distributional outcomes, essential for designing alternatives that preserve the fiscal benefits while reducing the distributional harm. The choice of survey dataset is one of the most consequential methodological decisions in microsimulation, and we need to understand the strengths and limitations of each option. The FRS is the default for the TTM's direct tax and benefit calculations. Its income data is detailed enough to model income tax, national insurance, and most means-tested benefits accurately. At around 25,000 households per year, it is large enough for most national-level distributional analysis. But it does not contain expenditure data, which means it cannot be used to model VAT and excise duties. For indirect tax modelling, the TTM uses the Living Costs and Food Survey. The LCF records household expenditure through diary methods and is the source of the Engel curve analysis in Lecture 4. Its drawback is sample size. At around 5,000 households per year, many subgroup analyses produce estimates too imprecise to be reliable. This is why Reed's 2020 paper uses a 6-year pooled LCF sample, combining data across years to increase the effective sample size at the cost of some temporal precision. The confidentiality restrictions are real constraints that shape what analysis is possible. The absence of sexual orientation and gender reassignment data from EUL datasets means that discrimination against lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender and queer, LGBTQ+, individuals in the benefit system cannot be modelled from household survey data. The absence of UC sanction data, one of the most contested and potentially harmful aspects of 2010's welfare reform, means this important policy dimension cannot be evaluated with the same rigour as other changes. These are not just academic limitations. They represent genuine gaps in the evidence base for policy design and scrutiny. It is worth spending time on strengths and weaknesses of approaches because it is honest self-assessment that distinguishes credible from overconfident policy research. The 3 strengths are genuine and significant. The cumulative analysis capability allowed the TTM to produce findings that directly contested government narratives. The granular breakdown capability allowed the EHRC to commission legal standard evidence on whether welfare reforms were discriminatory. And the transparency of the methodology, sufficient detail for replication, is what allowed the findings to be challenged and verified by independent researchers. The weaknesses are equally real. The static nature of the model means it cannot capture the feedback between fiscal changes and labour supply, or between income changes and health outcomes. The health modelling in Lecture 7 is an attempt to address this limitation, but it requires a separate methodological apparatus. Sample size constraints are a practical limitation that forces analytical compromises. Pooling across years is the standard response, but it means treating the political and economic context as stable across several years, which is not always appropriate. The data gaps, no UC sanction data, no sexual orientation data, only approximate local housing allowance modelling, represent genuine areas where the evidence base is weaker than analysts would like. The practical lesson: when you use or cite microsimulation evidence, always be explicit about which specific limitations apply to the analysis in question. Not all limitations affect all applications of the model equally. The parameter set is the control panel of the UK fiscal system. Understanding what each parameter does, what its current value is, and how sensitive the distributional outcomes are to changes in each. This is the fiscal literacy that professional policy analysts need. The income tax structure in England, Wales and Northern Ireland has 4 parameters: the personal allowance, the amount you can earn tax-free, the basic rate, the higher rate threshold, and the additional rate threshold. Scotland has its own 5-rate system with different thresholds, reflecting the tax devolution powers granted after 2015. The personal allowance is the most politically prominent parameter. Its increase from £6,475 to £12,500 during the 2010s was consistently presented as the government's progressive flagship policy. Universal credit is the most complex benefit parameter set. The standard rates for single adults and couples set the baseline entitlement for households with no children. The child rates add to this. The taper rate of 55% determines how quickly UC is withdrawn as earnings rise. A reduction in the taper rate was one of the major announcements in the 2021 autumn budget, at a cost of around £8 billion. The 2-child limit means that UC child payments stop after the second child, creating the £5,000 plus annual losses for large families documented by Reid 2020. The pension parameters are particularly important for poverty analysis because pensioners have historically had lower poverty rates than working-age adults, partly due to the triple lock-up rating mechanism for the state pension. The new state pension of £221.20 per week is considerably higher than the UC standard rate, which is part of why pensioner poverty rates differ from working-age poverty rates even among households with similar earned incomes. These numbers are what you need for Lecture 7. When you are designing a reform package with a £20 billion envelope or any other fiscal constraint, you need to know the approximate cost or yield of each lever before you can make informed choices about which combination to use. The income tax numbers illustrate the asymmetry between the different rates. Raising the basic rate by 1 percentage point raises £6 billion because the basic rate applies to the largest number of taxpayers. Raising the higher rate by the same amount raises only £2 billion because fewer people pay it. Raising the additional rate raises less than £1 billion and with significant concerns about avoidance responses. This asymmetry has political implications. A government wanting to raise revenue through income tax, with the least distributional impact on the poorest, has strong grounds for a basic rate rather than an allowance-based approach. The universal credit numbers illuminate the policy trade-offs directly. Raising adult rates by £100 per month, from about £393 to £493 for a single adult, costs £8 billion. Cutting the taper rate from 55% to 45% also costs £8 billion, but these are very different reforms. The adult rate increase primarily benefits those out of work or with very low earnings. The taper rate cut primarily benefits those in work whose income is in the UC withdrawal range. Whether you prioritise deep poverty reduction or work incentives determines which of these is the better use of the same £8 billion. The pension credit figure, £15 billion for a £10 per week increase, is worth noting because it illustrates how expensive per unit improvements to pensioner incomes are relative to working age benefits. This is a function of the number of pensioners and the high take-up rate of pension credit among those entitled. It is one reason why means-tested pensioner benefits are difficult to improve incrementally and why the triple lock on the state pension has such large fiscal implications. Two important extensions to the basic TTM are covered in this section, and both illustrate the broader potential of microsimulation beyond its core use case. The forecasting extension works by applying external projections to the existing household data rather than building a new model of the future. ONS population projections forecast how the age structure, household composition and geographic distribution of the UK population will evolve. OBR earnings forecasts project how incomes will grow across the distribution. By reweighting the FRS to match these projected characteristics, The TTM can produce poverty estimates for 2025 or 2030 that are internally consistent with official macroeconomic and demographic forecasts. This is not the model forecasting the future itself. It is the model applying official projections to estimate distributional outcomes under different policy scenarios. The Harrop and Reed 2015 projections are remarkable in retrospect. Published in 2015, they warned that 15 years of flat incomes for low-income families would mean food banks would shift from a temporary crisis response to an entrenched feature of British life, and that renters would see their living standards fall the most as housing costs consumed an ever larger share of income. Both projections proved accurate. This is a powerful illustration of what careful, evidence-based forward projection can achieve when it is grounded in the right analytical framework. The public spending model is a more complex extension. Beyond cash transfers, austerity involved around £17 billion of real terms, cuts to in-kind public services by 2015 to 16, health, education, social care, housing, police. The PSM estimates the distributional impact of these cuts by allocating service usage to individuals in the FRS using probabilities estimated from 4 additional survey datasets. The result? That in-kind spending cuts were regressive, with the lowest income decile losing around 8% of their final income, was a crucial empirical contribution to the debate about the true cost of austerity. The version 2 PSM uses only understanding society for all service use variables, simplifying the methodology considerably while enabling integration with the direct tax and benefit analysis. The title of this conclusion, Evidence That Changed the Argument, is a stronger claim than we usually make in academic settings, and it is worth pausing on. The TTM's cumulative distributional analysis of austerity was cited in Hansard, commissioned by the Equality and Human Rights Commission, and appeared in national newspapers and parliamentary committee evidence. The finding that the bottom 2 deciles bore the largest proportional losses from 2010 to 17 reforms, while the upper middle of the distribution actually gained, directly contradicted the government's claim that austerity was being fairly shared. The model made that contradiction legible. The first thread is the cumulative method. Individual reforms looked defensible in isolation. The personal allowance increase was genuinely progressive for working households above the income tax threshold. The minimum wage increase did benefit low-paid workers. But when the full set of reforms was modelled together, direct taxes, indirect taxes, benefits tax credits, universal credit, the benefit cap, the 2-child limit, and the living wage, the cumulative picture was starkly different. Gains from income tax cuts flowed disproportionately to deciles 8 and 9. Losses from benefit cuts fell hardest on decile 2. Only cumulative analysis reveals this interaction, which is precisely why governments tend to present reform packages, measure by measure rather than in aggregate. The second thread is dataset choice as research design. The FRS is the default because it has the most detailed income and benefit information at the benefit unit level, but it cannot model VAT. For that you need the LCF's expenditure diaries. It cannot produce reliable subgroup estimates for rare household types without multi-year pooling. It cannot model the impact on sexual orientation or gender reassignment because EUL versions omit those variables, and it cannot model UC sanctions because sanction data is not released. Each of these is not a flaw in the FRS. It is a boundary condition of the research question, and crossing it requires a different dataset or method. The third thread is honest accounting of weaknesses. Static microsimulation does not model behavioral responses. It cannot tell you whether cutting UC taper rates will increase labour supply. It cannot model health impacts directly. That requires the panel structure of understanding society. Geographic granularity below the regional level is severely limited by sample size. The appropriate response is not to apologize for these constraints. It is to state them in the methods section, report them in briefings, and design research questions the method can actually answer. The fourth thread is the Ready Reckoner. This table translates political promises into fiscal costs at a level of specificity that allows scrutiny. When a manifesto promises to remove the two-child limit, the Ready Reckoner says that costs £2 billion per year. When it promises to raise pension credit by £10 per week, the Ready Reckoner says £15 billion. When commitments are combined, you can read off the approximate total fiscal cost before any full modelling is done. The Ready Reckoner is the translation layer between policy and fiscal reality. The fifth thread is the extension to public services spending. The standard TTM analysis covers cash transfers and direct tax liabilities, but austerity also cut health, education, social care, housing and police spending. The public services spending model assigns approximately 75% of public expenditure to individuals and finds that the lowest decile lost around 8% of their final income from in-kind service cuts between 2010 and 2015. That loss is invisible in cash income analysis and absent from HBAI poverty statistics. Yet it fell hardest on exactly the households bearing the largest losses from benefit cuts. Without the PSM, the distributional picture of austerity was systematically incomplete. Lecture 7 extends the analytical infrastructure into two new domains: health microsimulation, using the Understanding Society panel to estimate health impacts of income changes and link distributional analysis to QALY estimates and NHS cost savings, and basic income modelling, which uses the same TTM parameter set to evaluate a policy restructuring the entire direct tax and benefit system simultaneously. Both use the same foundational logic: apply rules to household data, aggregate, compare, but answer questions income distributional analysis alone cannot. The methods you have learned today are the platform for those questions. If you have access to an account, please move on to practical demonstrations 5 and 6.